Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Czech National Bank's meeting with analysts. Thank you for joining us at our regular meeting at which we present and discuss the new macroeconomic forecast of the Czech National Bank and the Bank Board's most recent monetary policy decisions. The speakers for today are Bank Board member Karina Kubelková.
Good morning.
Executive Director of Monetary Department Petr Král.
Hello to everyone.
And Director of the Macroeconomic Forecasting Division of the Monetary Department, Karel Musil.
Good morning.
And now I'll turn over to Petr Král, who will present the new macroeconomic forecast.
Thank you for the floor. Good morning once again from my side. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is my great pleasure and honor to be here again after 3 months to deliver CNB's new quarterly macroeconomic forecast. Let me start by introducing the structure of my presentation. The first part will be dedicated to the assumptions based on which the new forecast was prepared. After that, I will provide you with a in-depth insight into the story and into the quantitative dimension of the new forecast. Later on, I will briefly compare the new forecast with the previous one. And final part of my presentation will be dedicated to 2 monetary policy simulations we prepared to facilitate monetary policy decision-making of the board on its yesterday's meeting. Countries of our major trading partners, which is the euro area, have so far succeeded to avoid a recession, exhibiting mild quarter-on-quarter growth in GDP in the first quarter, according to latest available data. But in annual terms, the GDP growth will be much slower compared to the previous year and will be close to zero in year-on-year term during this year. This will be driven by downswing in global demand, which is negatively affected by a decline in real disposable income of households across the global economy. On the other hand, industrial producer price growth in the effective euro area has culminated already sometimes ago. And now we are on a downward trend in its year-on-year dynamics. And the growth rate will switch into a negative territory this year. In 2024, industrial prices will be stagnating on average, being driven by both core foreign prices, which will converge to zero from above, and to diminishing negative contributions of energy prices, which will, on the other hand, converge to zero from below. The outlook for crude price oil hasn't changed much since the previous forecast and is still consistent with slightly decreasing crude oil prices in the rest of this year and in the next year, despite some recent volatility on the spot market. The outlook for monetary policy in the euro area remains also relatively stable compared to our previous forecast. The markets expect further tightening of the ECB's monetary policy using both standard and non-standard or unconventional monetary policy tools. The ECB decided not to reinvest fully the maturing assets, maturing bonds in its balance sheets, which is generating a positive shadow component within our computation of the shadow rate. That's why the shadow rate is somewhat above the expected 3-month Euribor interest rate as such. And the reduction of the balance sheet is explaining that. As for the domestic fiscal outlook, we can expect that nominal government consumption growth will continue at a pace slightly below 5% this year, which is very similar to last year's outcome. And the factors standing behind that will be the similar also, which is further increases in wages and salaries in public sector, accompanied by increased expenditure, public expenditure in healthcare and education, which is closely linked to the accommodation of the Ukrainian refugees in our country. For the next year, as part of this extra spending fade away, the nominal government consumption growth will decelerate somewhat to 4 to 3%. Fiscal impulse, which in our forecast represents the overall fiscal effect on economic activity and domestic demand component, is expected to be roughly neutral this year, which is an effect of fade away of last year support measures, which were aimed at help to both domestic households and enterprises to withstand the energy shock. And on the other hand, there are some further measures on both expenditure and revenue side of public budgets that compensate that. Full end of supportive measures to domestic economy, combined with a very gradual start of the drawdown of money from the EU funds, will lead to a moderately negative fiscal impulse for 2024 of minus 0.4 percentage points as a contribution to the year-on-year GDP growth in our country. Let me now turn your attention to the new macroeconomic forecast as such. We can expect that after peaking during the autumn of last year and after second peak at the very beginning of this year, inflation has started has started its downward trend, and this downward trend will continue during spring and summer this year. One can say that in the coming few months, year-on-year CPI monthly inflation will be by more than 1 percentage point lower than in the previous month, and we will breach the 10% level around mid of the year. Then the downward trend in inflation will stop for some time because of low base effect, or low base of last year because of this base effect. I will be talking about it more in detail when describing regulated price outlook. And as from the beginning of next year, the downward trend in inflation will accelerate further, and inflation will drop to 2% at the first part of 2024, and will stabilize there for the rest of the forecast horizon. This disinflation pattern will be driven by both core inflation, food price inflation, and regulated price growth. But in the first part of this year, core inflation deceleration will be the primary driver, which will be accompanied by a very strong, very deep year-on-year decline in fuel prices because of the high base effect, or because of high base from the same period of the last year. The deceleration process regarding core inflation and food price inflation will reflect the gradually diminishing overall cost pressures in the economy and gradually declining profit margins or markups in the economy, which have just peaked. To that gradual decline in markups and to the cooling of domestic demand in this declining markups and in this effect of declining demand, one can find effects of the previous tightening of domestic monetary conditions. So the headline inflation will be close to our 2% target on the monetary policy horizon, which is now the second and the third quarter of 2024, and the monetary policy relevant inflation, which is headline inflation excluding primary effects of changes to indirect taxation, will be only marginally below the headline inflation because of some further changes or increases in excise duties on tobacco. The inflation deceleration will be broad-based, as you can easily see in this upper graph. Core inflation will continue to decline. Its decline started already in the autumn last year. Food price growth culminated a bit later, but it is now expected to decline also quite significantly. I was already talking about the very negative fuel price growth to be expected for this year, but the contribution is relatively mild in this graph because of the low weight of this specific subcomponent. And administered price growth will be relatively significant and relatively stable this year, but it will be declining quite sharply as from the beginning of next year. Within the core inflation segment, we can expect further significant decrease in the contribution of imputed rents, which is reflecting the tightening of monetary conditions, leading to very subdued mortgage market and real estate market, and declining prices of new flats and apartments, accompanied by strong deceleration of prices of consumption works and construction works and construction materials. But the rest of the core segment will also decelerate, being driven by both goods prices and service prices also. As for the administered price growth, we can expect that in the coming months and let's say 2 quarters, there will be a tendency of its year-on-year growth to go down relatively sharply, because the process of cutting the electricity, natural gas prices below the ceilings, the caps that have been introduced by the government as from January this year has already started. So some electricity and natural gas providers have already started to offer prices that are below those caps. And this is reflected into our new forecast. But in the autumn of this year, very low base of the previous year will lead to a further reacceleration of this regulated price growth, because in the autumn of last year, electricity prices were temporarily decreased significantly for a short, for 3 months, as the government savings, energy savings tariffs was directly influencing the official CPI data. As from the beginning of 2024, after this base effect fades away, we can expect a significant drop of the dynamics of the regulated price growth almost to 0 or to 1%, with gas prices for households being in a negative territory when it comes to the overall to the year-on-year change, whereas the electricity prices will be growing at a non-negligible but moderate growth rate, as the forecast assumes reintroduction of the fee on the renewable energy sources, which was temporarily suspended for this year by last year government decision. As for the cost pressures in the domestic consumer sector, we can say that the peak is already behind us, and we are now on a very significant downward trend, which is being driven especially by declining contributions of energy import prices, and to a certain extent also by diminishing core import prices contributions, whereas intermediate goods prices growth remains relatively stable and relatively significant, which is expected to prevail even for some quarters to come. These domestic cost pressures stem from the still very heightened nominal wage growth in business area, which is accompanied by relatively mild anti-inflationary contributions of productivity gains and by some recovery of price of capital contribution to the overall cost pressures. Domestic cost pressures stemming, as I was already mentioning, primarily from heightened nominal wage growth will decelerate only slightly throughout the rest of this year, and this will be driven the overall price pressure dynamics from the domestic economy. So domestic pressures together with gradually diminishing domestic pressures and already declining foreign price pressures will support the disinflation process in the economy, which will be facilitated by expected decline of the overall profit margins or markups in the economy. This is the case not only for the consumer sector, but also for the intermediate production sector. And altogether, this should lead to a very significant disinflation process I have just described. As for the labor market, we can say that the previous tightening of the conditions in the domestic labor market was relatively mild, but was visible. We definitely moved to a less pro-inflationary stance of the domestic labor market, but not fully to a neutral stance. And expecting the gradual recovery of the domestic economy, which I will be talking about later on, we can expect that the tightness on the labor market will renew its growth in the coming quarters. This is consistent with our expectations of roughly flat total employment in the economy, and with only slightly increasing the unemployment rate, which is, from a level perspective, still extraordinarily low by international standard, and its expected increase is relatively very, very moderate. This not negligible tightness of the labor market is reflected in our forecast of nominal wage growth in the business area, and pressures on on accelerating nominal wage growth in this sphere is also supported by the still very high inflation we can observe around us. That's why, and following the recent available data from industry and construction and some other leading and coincident indicators, we can expect that nominal wage growth, as for the average nominal wage, will accelerate to almost 10% at the beginning of this year, and will be close to 9%, let's say, in the rest of this year, with some mild tendency to decelerate in the 2024 year. In real terms, naturally, the current stance or current position of real wages is very, very negative. In other words, the real wage growth is significantly negative, but this very deep decline will quite sharply fading away as inflation will be going down very, very steeply, and as the nominal wage growth will be relatively high and relatively persistent. We can expect that the Czech economy will grow modestly this year in annual terms, and that the previous recession we experienced during the second half of 2022 is already behind us, and the flash estimate of the GDP provided by the Czech Statistical Office for the first quarter of this year, saying that there was a 0.1% Q-on-Q growth in GDP, interrupted the shallow recession we observed during the second half of last year. By the way, this 0.1 Q-on-Q GDP dynamics was fully in line with our new forecast. In the year as a whole, we can expect, as I was already mentioning, the growth of GDP of 0.5%, which will be driven primarily by positive contribution of net exports, together with some positive effect from growing fixed capital formation or fixed investment, especially in the business sector. On the other hand, declining real consumption will be curbing recovery of the economy, and we can expect that only through the end of this year, the year-on-year dynamics of real consumption will turn to a positive territory. For 2024, we can expect that GDP will accelerate to 3%, with household consumption making already a significant positive contribution. On the top of that, there will be another significant contribution from net exports and continuous positive contribution of gross fixed capital formation. Let's have a look at the individual components in more detail. Household consumption will be in a very negative territory for this year. We can expect a further mild quarter-on-quarter decline in the real in the real household consumption. But as from the second half of this year, we can expect that Q-on-Q dynamics of household consumption will turn to positive territory, which will mean that at the end of this year, year-on-year figure will be close to zero, and next year we can expect relatively sharp acceleration of the real consumption growth, real household consumption growth. The government consumption growth will fluctuate somewhat, but on average it will be in positive figures. Capital formation as a whole will be significantly influenced by very fluctuating contributions of changes in inventories that led its growth or that drove its growth in the previous years, as firms were, let's say, building extraordinary precautionary inventories when changing their functioning from just-in-time to just-in-the-case mode, as the global value chains were functioning not properly. And we can expect that this particular period is more or less definitely behind us, and that the cutting the inventories will lead to that a significant negative contribution to the overall investment activity in the economy. On the other hand, private investment in fixed capital will be still growing, not significantly, but there will be some positive growth which will further accelerate in 2024. And public investment will make a positive contribution this year, whereas for 2024 we can expect slightly negative effect as the new programming EU funds period will be starting only gradually. Both export and imports dynamic will accelerate in the coming quarters, which will in total lead to very significant positive contributions of net exports. This will be driven by both gradual recovery in the demand in the countries of our major trading partners, and secondly, the previous problems in the production and value chains are expected to be fully away during the first half of this year, and further on we can the Czech manufacturing and export-oriented industry will operate freely. Our new forecast foresees the koruna euro exchange rate to be at 23.5 koruna for the second quarter of this year, and then we can expect a gradual weakening of the domestic currency against the euro. This will be affected by gradual receding of the wave of positive sentiment we observed during autumn last year or during winter and first months of this year. And secondly, this will be driven also by gradually narrowing interest rate differential of the Czech koruna vis-à-vis the euro area. But on the other hand, there are factors that will be curbing potential further depreciation of the domestic currency, which are the expected renewal of positive trade balance and current account balance, which will be consistent with the expected unrestricted functioning of domestic export-oriented manufacturing, and also by the fact that the previous, let's say, direct effects of the war on the countries and currencies in our region are fully away. The new forecast is consistent with the initial stability of the nominal interest rates at their current levels and with subsequent gradual decline of the rates from the second half of this year onwards. The initial stability of the nominal interest rates reflects receding extraordinary inflation pressures from both external and domestic side, together with some necessity or need to combat the potential second round effects of those previous very strong inflation factors. Continuous decline in foreign price pressures, together with the expected gradual evaporating of domestic fundamental inflation pressures, will lead to significant inflation deceleration during this year and especially during next year, which will be somewhat supported also by base effects. This together will, let's say, will be consistent with the possibility to start declining domestic nominal interest rates further this year, as the stabilization of inflation close to our 2% target is in the reach, or is within the reach and within the outlook. Let me now briefly compare our new forecast with the previous one. As for the headline inflation, we can say that the new forecast was upgraded somewhat for this year, which in annual terms is approximately 0.5 percentage points higher profile, which is driven by somewhat higher food price inflation, especially at the beginning of forecast horizon, and also by somewhat less steep decline of core inflation. The GDP outlook, on the other hand, was revised upwards for this year and the next, which is on the account of higher net export contributions together with some stronger recovery in household consumption expected within this new forecast. Also, somewhat more lively investment activity is a driver of that upward revision of GDP outlook. Higher wage growth, which is part of our new forecast when compared to the previous one, is driven by somewhat more strongly growing wages at the very beginning of this year in the environment of somewhat higher inflation and somewhat more tightened labor market and more significant demand for labor from the side of domestic firms. The shift in the exchange rate forecast towards stronger levels compared to the previous one is consistent with the observed stronger levels of the Czech koruna at the very beginning of this year. As for the decomposition of the interest rate forecast change, we can identify several major groups of factors. The initial state is making a downward contribution to that decomposition, which is reflecting primarily the lower initial level of the interest rates, because the increase of the interest rates predicted by the previous forecast was not realized. But there is also some other contribution in the same direction, stemming from somewhat stronger exchange rate at the very beginning of this year, and with some other observations from the real economy. The second significant contributor to that in this direction is the exchange rate near-term forecast, because for the second quarter of this year we now expect exchange rate to be quite significantly stronger compared to the previous outlook. The negative contributions of administered price growth reflect faster decline in energy prices below the government-imposed price ceilings for this year. And on the other hand, there is a bulk of expert judgments or adjustments that are making a positive contribution to this interest rate decomposition. And there are at least three important representatives among those judgments. The first one is the expert incorporation of later and slower closure of the gap in markups or in the profit margins in the domestic intermediate goods sector. The second one is faster wage growth in spring and summer, which is expected in the new forecast and is, let's say, incorporated in the forecast by this expert judgment. And the third one is making an opposite contribution and is representing the curbing effect of the narrowing interest rate differential on the exchange rate development, which had been incorporated into the previous forecast and the previous several forecasts, but this time we somewhat increased the intensity of this expert judgment. Let me now introduce monetary policy simulations we prepared besides the baseline scenario in order to facilitate the monetary policy discussion on yesterday's board meeting. The first scenario is consistent with the expected stability of the domestic nominal interest rates at their current levels till the end of this year. That's why for the second half of this year, in this scenario, the nominal interest rates are somewhat higher compared to the baseline scenario. Exchange rate is reacting to that higher nominal interest rates by being somewhat stronger, which in total means that both components of domestic monetary conditions are more tightened in this scenario compared to the baseline. This leads to somewhat less intensive inflation pressures from the domestic economy and from the import side, or in other words, to a more significant, more pronounced disinflation process in this scenario compared to the baseline, which at the end of this year and during next year, especially on the monetary policy horizon, leads to some undershooting of the 2% inflation target, and the deviation in this scenario from the baseline when it comes to inflation is approximately 0.6 percentage points at the second and third quarter of next year. The impact on other domestic variables is to somewhat slightly lower real GDP growth and relatively significantly lower nominal wage growth in business area. The other scenario combines this assumption regarding the expected stability of the nominal interest rates at the current levels till the end of this year with the less pronounced decline of model consistent inflation expectations compared to baseline. In the baseline, there are model consistent expectations of economic agents that see the peak of inflation and see the expected path of inflation, which can be characterized as a relatively steep disinflation. We compared this endogenous model consistent unobserved inflation expectations with observed inflation expectations measured by surveys available in our country. Specifically, we constructed a common inflation expectation index, which is summarizing somewhat the professional forecasters' expectations of inflation together with business and households' inflation expectations. And we, in a structural way, adjusted the model to, let's say, copy the recent past of this new inflation expectation index. And compared to the baseline, the peak of endogenous inflation expectations in this scenario comes somewhat later and is somewhat at somewhat higher levels, and its subsequent decline is somewhat less steep compared to the baseline scenario. So we are kind of replicating the profile of the surveyed expectations by the model consistent endogenous expectations, and for the quarters to come, we expect less expected disinflation in the model in this scenario compared to the baseline scenario. The combination of monetary policy being the same, being characterized by stable interest rates until the end of this year, together with higher inflation expectations contribution to the domestic price setting of firms, leads to higher domestic price pressures. Simultaneously, the heightened expectations compared to the baseline are consistent with some somewhat more significant counter risk premium, which is affecting the nominal exchange rate profile, which is which is somewhat weaker compared to the baseline scenario, together with higher pressures on nominal wages. This leads to some overshooting of the inflation target at our monetary policy horizon during next year. In other words, combination of unchanged monetary policy with inflation expectations being less positive compared to the baseline scenario assumptions leads to some overshooting of our inflation target in this specific monetary policy scenario. Having said that, I would like to thank you for your attention by now, and I am passing the floor back to our spokesperson, Petra Vlčková.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. You probably have many questions, so let's move directly to the Q&As. Before we start, I would like to remind you, please do not forget to introduce yourselves and do not forget to activate your microphone before you speak. So, is there anyone who wants to ask the first question?
Good morning, Pavel Sobíšek, UniCredit Bank. I would like to ask first Petr Král whether the promised fiscal consolidation of the government was not at all incorporated in the model. And if it was not, what would fiscal impulse were next year if the government keeps its promise to cut imbalance by 70 billion crowns? Thank you.
The pre-announced fiscal consolidation plans are not incorporated into the baseline scenario because those are not specified yet fully and in detail to be able to be incorporated in our forecast in a structural way, as we typically work with fiscal packages. I do not want now to give you any estimates of the potential fiscal impacts of the consolidation, of the potential impacts of the fiscal consolidation package. In the past, we published several scenarios in which fiscal consolidation or fiscal expansionary packages were simulated. So I would like you to refer to our previous monetary policy or inflation reports to get some feeling about the sensitivity of our macro outlook to potentially different fiscal policy assumptions. Thank you.
Next question, anyone?
Jaromír Šindel, Citibank. I would like to follow up. To be honest, I don't understand it. The yesterday presentation, when the fiscal policy was highlighted as a key potential driving force or trigger for the higher policy rate in June or in forthcoming meetings. Because if I look at the forecast, your forecast envisaged 2.5% GDP deficit in 2024. You have an incorporated fiscal consolidation, which is most likely to happen. We don't know the size, we don't know the composition. So I just don't understand why the specifically fiscal policy should be an argument for the rest of the board for hiking the policy rate in forthcoming meetings. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Fiscal policy was one of the arguments of the bank board. Still, the composition of the fiscal stance really matters. Because the fiscal policy or even the fiscal consolidation package could be inflationary on the horizon of the monetary policy. Yeah, it depends, for example, if it will be focused mainly on indirect taxes, you know, it can be inflationary pressure. It really depends on the structure. the different composition has different multipliers and different effects.
Okay, next question, please.
I would like you to elaborate a little bit about this. If we understand it, the neutral scenario for the central bank at the moment is that there will be no consolidation, meaning that even with no consolidation, current interest rate level would bring inflation to the target within the forecasting horizon. Now we are speaking about some consolidation which would be anti-inflationary, ceteris paribus. So why now or in June a pressure for higher rates? Thank you.
Okay, fiscal policy was just one of the arguments, but we discussed also inflation expectations and a wage price spiral. So I will present the arguments of those board members who are ready to hike on the last monetary policy meeting. So if you can show them scenario, alternative scenario, which was made. Yeah, it's a combination of keeping interest rates unchanged and elevated inflation expectations. So even with this, with keeping rates unchanged, the result is that the inflation will not be on the target. So the keeping rates unchanged, it will not be enough to offset this effect. So this scenario was one of the main arguments for those who were for hiking. And then this morning, the boxes the boxes were presented on our webpage. Maybe you have seen the box number 2 from our latest forecast. This is about measuring the risk of a wage price spiral. So, there in this analysis, there is an evidence of materialization of wage price spiral. So this was also one of the important arguments for those who were ready to hike yesterday. These are.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Jaromír Šindel, I would like to ask you about the wage growth. I was a little bit surprised by the downward revision of the wage growth, of the market sector wage growth in the first quarter of this year, despite we have observed stronger industrial and construction wage growth. So what is behind this downward revision for the first quarter? Thank you.
So indeed, that's not just these strong numbers that were coming from the industries and construction, but also other indicators that finally indicate us that the growth might be a bit muted, but it does not mean that the wage growth will not accelerate for the next quarter, when we expect that the growth will be higher. So indeed, it's just let's say combination of the indicators that were available.
On the top of the newly available data for January, February and March of this year, there was some downward revision of the fourth quarter of previous year, and the data for the fourth quarter growth in private sector were somewhat below our previous forecast.
Thank you. Any other questions?
If I can, follow up with the last sentence about the expert judgment regarding the change of a 3-month PRIBOR trajectory. And I'm not sure whether it was also the part of the previous presentation, but I haven't noticed this sentence in the previous presentation. So does this sentence mean that there is an agreement of the bank board that during the cutting the policy rate, the CNB is ready to intervene at the FX market, or it is wrong, this interpretation of this sentence?
From the perspective of the forecast and of this graph, this is not new information. This was a part of the same slide during the previous and previous forecast rounds. We only changed the magnitude of this expert judgment, seeing the stronger than expected nominal exchange rate at the turn of the year. And this is an expert representation of the fact that interest rate differential might be not working fully in line with the assumptions of our model in the environment when the sentiment is hit by the energy crisis and by the war, and when the economy is undergoing very negative terms of trade shock, which is sharply turning the previous very significantly positive trade balance into a negative territory. And all the things together lead us to this expert judgment, and its magnitude has changed somewhat to a bigger effect, but it is not a new thing, and it doesn't relate anyhow to the policy on the exchange rate front.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
Dominik Strukal. I would like to come back to the consolidation package, because I understand that I would like to keep the number of alternative scenarios to minimum, but when you start to do them, why not to include one with other unknown, which I understand that we do not know what will be in the package, but we kind of know. I will tell you at least the contours, so we could model what would happen. And Ms. Kulka said that they discussed not only the consolidation package, but also the wage price spiral and the others, and we have the models for it. So the question is maybe for you, why not to have one another, saying that I know that we would like to keep the scenarios to a minimum?
As for the baseline, we tend to follow the best practice, which says that no policy change scenario is applied when the fiscal policy package is not specified fully and is not approved, or if there is if there is little probability that it will be approved in a few months or weeks. This is a rule which we apply according to the ESCB instructions, by the way. But this would not prevent us from making an alternative scenario. But for any alternative scenario, we need to know exactly what will be the composition of the package on both revenue and expenditure side, what will be expected, what is expected on the change when it comes to changes of indirect taxation, whether there will be some cuts in subsidies and investment outlays, or whether this go to the nominal disposal income of domestic households, and many other things and specifications we unfortunately do not know yet, and that's why we are not able to simulate any fiscal consolidation package yet. We expect that the government will come up with some specification in the coming future, and we will be able to simulate it in the next round.
Thank you. Next question.
Coming back to yesterday's decision-making, I understand that one of the reasons for some of the board members to propose higher rates was a concern about inflation expectations de-anchoring, which is a fair argument. My question is whether there were more arguments of those who were proposing higher rates than this one, and then fiscal policy, which we already talked about. Thank you.
The argument was that a hike by 0.25, it's not enough. It's more about signaling the higher increase of rates would be more effective to tame the inflation and to stop this wage price spiral. Just like more effective measure than just a signaling hike of 0.25.
Is there anyone who has a question? Okay, thank you.
Good morning, Roman Reda, Czech Chamber of Commerce. I will have a question regarding the international trade. Czech crown appreciated significantly since and during last year, and yet for 2023 you expect international trade to be one of the main contributors to economical growth. Isn't it possible that net exports, their contribution, and then GDP will be actually way lower because of the strong currency?
According to our estimates of the equilibrium real exchange rate, we can say that we are somewhat on a stronger side, which is meaning simultaneously that both components of our real monetary condition index are in a restrictive monetary policy stance, which is good for fighting inflation. Simultaneously, it might, to a certain extent, affect the situation in the exporting companies who are, let's say, driven to cut their costs, including their wage bills. And simultaneously, those firms are those who are able to withdraw money from euro-denominated loans from domestic or foreign banks or loans within the multinational companies. Simultaneously, the forecast expects that the previous problems in functioning of the global value chains will completely disappear during the first half of this year, which will be additional stimulus for Czech export-oriented manufacturing industry, especially automotive sector, and the negative terms of trade shock, which was hitting the domestic economy extremely during the previous quarters, is now expected to fade away quite significantly, which is also making the nominal trade balance to turn positive significantly in the coming months. Simultaneously, domestic demand, especially household consumption, is very subdued and will be subdued in the quarters to come because of the huge decline in the real disposable income of domestic households, and the import component content within domestic household consumption is also not negligible. That's why the positive net export contribution in real terms to GDP growth in real terms is driven by both a better export performance and somewhat curbed import intensity of domestic demand.
So any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I have one question on the bank board and second on the forecasting stuff. The first one is to the board about this statement to control the FX volatility, because in the recent interviews with the bank members, if there was a question about that, we have many times listened that the bank board has changed and the agreement hasn't yet been reached about how, let's say, how to eliminate this FX-related sentence from the statement. So is there any agreement how the CNB Bank Board will continue to use the FX intervention in forthcoming months or quarters? This is the first question. And the second, regarding the forecast. you have 3% GDP growth in 2024, annualized 2% quarter-on-quarter growth in the rest of the year, and despite that, you have relatively sluggish employment growth in the forecast. This helps you, let's say, to increase the productivity, to decrease the inflationary pressures from the wage growth. So this is what I a little bit perceive as something like an inflationary risk to your forecast, because you have relatively weak employment growth. And subsequent to that, you have 3.5% core CPI outlook for 2024, which, and I'm repeating myself from the previous meetings, would make me quite nervous to have the core CPI well above the target, we can say, if we should return to the normal years. So and my question is, what is currently the model outlook for 2025? Yeah, what we can expect, more better to question. You have the policy rate outlook below 4% by the end of 2024, and 3.5% core CPI growth. And my question is, what is the assumption of the model for 2025? I assume that there is something like a return to the steady state level that allows you to decrease the policy rate to the lower levels. And my question is that in the next meeting, we will have the forecast for 2025. So my question is, what would be your best guess to assume the core CPI growth for 2025 now, if we are not returning to the steady state level? Thank you. I'm sorry for not clear question. Thank you.
Yeah, for the bank board, so I can say we haven't agreed on any strategy to control FX in coming months.
I'll start with the question on the core inflation and interest rate path for 2025. You're right that we will expand our forecast horizon by 1 year in our next forecasting round, so I cannot provide you now with any insight into the 2025 year. And as for your question of on employment and its relation to productivity and potential inflation impacts within our new baseline scenario, I will ask Karel to comment on that.
Yeah, indeed, you are right that indeed the situation about the labor market is still somehow feeling like a tight labor market that will not disappear immediately, or that will be just within 1 year completely changed. So indeed, that's our view, that the tightness of the labor market that is currently even bigger or stronger will somehow continue over through the next year, and possibly it might generate pressure for the wage growth that will be higher than the, let's say, equilibrium or long run average that was typical for the labor market during the normal times.
Is there anyone who has a question? So I can see any other raised hands. So in case that there are no other questions, I would like to thank you all for coming. Thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you again in August. Thank you and goodbye.
Have a nice break.